I recently received a comment that constructed awareness came from EMDR, and there was an implication in the statement that constructed awareness was a part of EMDR. So I just wanted to come on here to make a quick video to speak to that, just in case other people have a similar assumption. So did constructed awareness come from EMDR? Yes. Is constructed awareness EMDR? No, and I'll explain. If you've ever done EMDR as a therapist or as a client, you know that there's a pattern that repeats. The therapist does this, the eye movements, and then they say, what are you noticing now? Whatever the client notices, they say that, and then the therapist says that again. Notice that. What are you noticing now? And that repeats over and over again. After probably thousands of sets of bilateral stimulation, I began to notice a pattern that people answered the question, what are you noticing now, in different ways. First, I noticed that some clients answer the question with all thoughts. They would use their minds to regulate themselves during the process. And also noticed outside of sessions, they tended to do the same thing. They use their mind to regulate themselves and to connect with other people. I began to associate that pattern as what I call a mental orientation. But then sometimes I would say, what are you noticing now? And clients would answer with all physical expressions, cathartic expressions, as if their body was running the show. Their body was doing all the regulating in the session. And again, I noticed that they tended to do that outside of session as well. So I identified that pattern as sensation-oriented. And then a third pattern emerged. Say, what are you noticing now? Some people tended to talk about anybody but themselves. Their focus was outside of themselves. They would answer in a way that I could tell they were editing their response to make sure they were taking care of me. So they were using their environment to regulate themselves. If the environment was okay, then they're okay. And I began to identify this pattern as externally oriented. What struck me is that people seem to prefer or to rely on one part of their experience over the others to regulate and to connect or to navigate the world. And those observations became the foundation for the second and third principles of CA, that reality is constructed by three building blocks, mind, body, and external, and that most people tend to rely more on one of the building blocks than they do the other two in different situations. So I decided, once I had this realization, to take all my clients who were doing EMDR back to phases 1 and 2 of EMDR. So there's 8 phases. Phases 1 and 2 are history taking and preparation. So my history taking became focused on identifying the client's orientation. Which building block are they relying on most? Because that would tailor make my resources. Because if a client were mentally oriented, for example, that tells me that their mental building block is overdeveloped and their sensation and external building blocks are less developed. So I began to develop awareness-based resources that would focus specifically on the building blocks that are less developed to bring those up so the client had a more balanced, connected way of answering that question, what are you noticing now? And that's really what I wanted to know. Would enhancing the underdeveloped building blocks also enhance EMDR reprocessing if the client could answer, what are you noticing now, from all parts of their experience, not just the one that they're really good at? And it turned out they could. It really did enhance the processing. Originally, my intention was to develop an advanced EMDR training that focused on phases 1 and 2. But as I developed what I was developing, it began to turn into something that just wasn't EMDR. When I compared it to the EMDR definition and EMDR's tenets, it just didn't match. And I realized I was creating something new. So in 2020, I stopped teaching EMDR full-time and instead moved to teaching and developing and researching CA full-time. I eventually developed what's called memory reconstructing and responsive processing, which are 2 ways of processing trauma that are unique to CA, which I find to be much softer than EMDR reprocessing. Although CA emerged from my practice with EMDR, it's not EMDR. CA doesn't use bilateral stimulation of any kind. Its mechanism of change that it relies on is awareness of the 3 building blocks, and all the techniques and interventions and even theories of CA are built around those principles. A comparison I make sometimes is DBT came out of CBT, but eventually it became its own model, and that's what happened. Yes, CA came from my work with EMDR, but eventually it became its own psychotherapeutic model, which has its own theories, principles, and interventions. So I hope this helped clarify what CA is in regard to EMDR and also give you a little story about where it came from. There's so much more that I could say about this topic, but for now I'll stop and I'll catch you next time.